So this morning we're going to be talking, as I mentioned, about residential buildings and focus on this morning's part will be on changes to NCC Volume 2, and as you all know, NCC Volume 2 applies to Class 1 and Class 10 buildings. We'll also be talking about changes to the Australian standards referenced in the code, and they have had a significant number of changes as well. And then the afternoon we'll focus on those changes that affect essentially low-rise Class 2 buildings where there's been quite a few changes, but they do have more broader application, the changes I'll talk to for Class 2 to 9 buildings and Volume 1 changes. As I mentioned about questions, as you could hold them over, on your tables today you have a thing called a Summary of Changes document. The Summary of Changes document is there for you to take away, and as I go through today, put some asterisks against certain things that you might want to go back into your offices and undertake more research on or have a bit more deeper look. It doesn't give a very detailed breakdown of all of them. It just gives you a snapshot of the changes. And as you can see, there's 21 A4 pages there. So I don't think it captures absolutely every change, but it's the ones that I think mostly affect your businesses. I mentioned about the questions, then we'll keep going. Also, as Greg mentioned, we're going to have Trent Bourne from the ABCB come up and do a little bit of a presentation this morning, and Vanessa Morris from the ACT government will also just talk about some of the variations here in the ACT. I'm going to try and make this a little bit, we are talking about national changes today, but try and bring it where relevant to the ACT, but also noting we probably have some people here from New South Wales, so we'll have those types of things as well, particularly when we get to energy efficiency, where there's some differences between how it applies for national versus your changes for BASICs in New South Wales, and then a couple of other subtle differences there around the planning for bushfire protection and other things. So try and keep those things both in mind as this for both the regions. So just in terms of what are the headline subjects we're going to be talking about today, here's just a snapshot of those for Volume 2 about changes to the governing requirements. The governing requirements are the rules of racing for the actual NCC, the Section A or the Section 1 requirements, often the most overlooked part of the code but the most important part of the code. There's been a lot of work from the ABCB have been undertaking about their project on the quantification of performance and those performance solutions in the code, and trying to put some more quantitative numbers and information to support the use of the performance-based code. The reference document changes. So Volume 2 references somewhere in the region of 86 primary standards, and Volume 1 references 126 primary standards. Some 50% of those standards have had some element of change. And that some of them might just be a correction amendment or a minor amendment. Some are more substantial amendments. Some have been removed, some have been added, but it does all add to that sheer volume of changes. If I was to tell you after that, those standards then reference secondary and tertiary standards that can get towards 2,000 to 3,000 standards that might be applicable to a building, it's pretty scary, isn't it? So, I won't be talking about 3,000 standards. We'll just talk about those ones that are going to be primarily about residential buildings and about those ones that I think that will have most effect on you. There's also been there's been an introduction of condensation management provisions into the BCA, and I'll talk about them in detail today. There's been energy efficiency changes both for residential buildings and for the Section J commercial provisions as well. There's been a substantial amount of content included back into the NCC itself rather than just reliance on reference standards. Part of that includes DTS provisions or deemed to satisfy provisions for masonry construction incorporated back into the code itself, which is really, and I'll talk a little bit about that project. Whenever we talk about changes to the code, there's always some changes around fire safety provisions, and there's been a number of changes there again. One of those changes is about including a deemed to satisfy solution for cantilevered separating walls. There's been some revised wall cladding provisions from terms of weatherproofing requirements, and also about revised sound insulation provisions. They're just some of the snapshots of what we're going to talk about just in the morning session, and then the afternoon session I'll go through those changes for Volume 1. So moving into the first part of it, and this is about those governing requirements or the Section A or the Section 1 requirements. And as I mentioned, these are the rules of racing about applying the code. They have the things about deemed to satisfy provisions, the use of assessment methods, how a performance solution needs to be developed, the documentary evidence requirements that apply, how you're supposed to interpret in definitions and reference documents, has all of that stuff. So the ABCB has been doing a lot of work in trying to revise these Section A requirements about making them more logical. That's resulted in quite a bit of changes to the code in terms of the front-end changes to the code are now consistent across volumes 1, 2 and 3. The language in the code is looking to be improved. Why are they doing this? And this is just a slide I've got up on here about the registered users of the code. And Greg mentioned in his introduction about part of HA's advocacy efforts around trying to get the code free, moving to a 3-year code, trying to reduce any barriers for accessing the requirements and trying to ensure that rather than churn of change of the requirements, that the requirements are there, they're in place for 3 years and people can educate on them, be aware of them. When the code used to be a paid subscription, there was about 12,000 subscribers to the code, annual subscribers. Since moving to a free code, it's now moved and having nearly 200,000 subscribers to the code. The biggest user group of the code now is residential builders, by far. And as you can see on this screen, 31,000. This is increasing week by week. This still needs to increase more and more. There's still a lot more people in the industry who use the code, but this is a substantial thing in under 2 years about moving from paid code to free code, about the people using the code. So if you've got this people using the code, the biggest user group, it needs to be written for the people who are going to be using the code predominantly. And this is part of the work that the ABCB have been trying to do to try and improve the readability of the code and that access and the supporting material that go with it to ensure that you have a well understood and well utilised code. And that can only help in raising levels of compliance. So part of that includes looking at rewriting some of the clauses of the code. So this is one clause in the code that is extremely difficult to understand. And I'll just read it out to you and I'll have to take a breath first. And it says, a story is not counted if, and I'll read you subclause Roman 2. It is situated partly below the finished ground level and the underside of the ceiling is not more than 1 metre above the finished ground level of the ground at the external wall, or if the external wall is more than 12 metres long, the average of the 12 metre part where the ground is at its lowest. How'd you go understanding that? You know, 51 words to one clause, and this is subclause B. There's already an A and a lead-in as well. So, and then you wonder why there's some levels of misunderstanding or of compliance or interpretation when you've got things like this written into the code. This isn't the worst. There's one that's 56 words, and there's some that get down to subclause ZZ. If you know the structure of the code, it's like 7 layers down. Other things in the code, it uses language like not more than. You know, the barrier must be not more than 1 metre, or not less than. I don't know if anyone went and ordered a coffee this morning and said, I want my flat white and not less than 2 sugars. You don't use that type of language in everyday life, so why put it into the code? And it's littered throughout the code like this. So we really applaud the ABCB's work in trying to improve the language of the code because it can only help in improving compliance. Here's one clause that's been through the readability ringer, and this is about the non-combustibility requirements in Volume 1. And previously this clause used to be in Table C11 and Clause C11, it would say building required of this type of construction for this class of building. Then it would send you to specification C1.1, 3.1b, and then it would tell you about this element of it would need to be non-combustible. Then it would then send you to another subclause of that specification. Where here it's just written into a clause. In a building required to be type A and B construction, the following elements need to be non-combustible, and list them out. Much simpler, much easier to use, much better to understand, and hence it's very difficult to not then be able to use as your defence as misunderstanding or misinterpretation. The code's not got there yet. There's still a lot of work to do, but that process has started and we really applaud that process. So in terms of the Section A or the Section 1 requirements, as I mentioned, these are the parts that it covers: interpreting the NCC, compliance in terms of DTS or performance, and other things like this. So you'll notice that front ends have changed of the code, and there's been quite a bit of changes there. It doesn't actually change how the code applies. The code still applies as it does, and it doesn't change technically anything, but it just improves the flow and makes it much more logical. So I'm going to get Trent Bourne to come up and just provide a little bit more detail of that readability and digitisation work of the Australian Building Codes Board. And if you're using the digital NCC now, you'll notice substantial changes and improvements that I've had. So I'll get Trent Bourne. Trent's the Chief Operating Officer of the ABCB, and I really appreciate Trent coming today and making a presentation.